Keith, and today I am going to give you another ghost story. Except it's not a ghost. It's more of "We want to drink your blood" type of story. And today's story takes us to the city of Liverpool, where a lot of these stories take place. And how do I know this? Because it's where I live. And I've been interested in the ghost and the paranormal side ever since I was a toddler. Now, today's story takes us to one of a relatively big side of Liverpool, and this is somewhere in Aintree. We have a gentleman whose occupation was a petty thief, and his name is Albert. And Albert had set off this evening. Well, it was not an evening, it's early hours, but to him it was an evening. So in the early hours of the morning, Albert had found himself outside a lockup, and he was trying to break in. And this was behind an alleyway of a pretty busy road. Now, he was an expert locksmith, so he was trying to pick the padlock off the door. And for whatever reason, he was unable to work his magic to unlock this pick lock. So it could have been something along the lines of the lock was just too hard to pick. It was cold this particular day, so he was unable to work his magic with his fingers. Or it was just a rusted lock that was far past its pickable times and it needed cutting off. So he took out his crowbar and he had a quick look up and down the road to make sure that nobody was coming. And there was not a soul in sight at this unearthly hour. So off he went to try and pry this padlock. And on this particular night, it was the night of a full moon, and with it being relatively clear sky, it lit up so he didn't really need a torch. And he was just about to prise the padlock off the door when Albert thought he heard someone or something behind him. So he turned round slowly, and he was expecting to see a priest, a man, someone stood behind him. But what he saw is something he has still to this day been unable to explain. And the fact that he is willing to open and be honest about his attempt at robbery, I think this serves as some good, solid evidence that a crook was willing to criminate himself to explain this story. So there, in front of him, was a figure who was about 6'8" in height. And he was slim and he seemed elderly, but he was very distinguished. He said that the distinguished man seemed to have an old Victorian attire. He had a cape and he had what he could only describe as a blue phosphorus glow about him. He said that his white hair seemed to come off into like points, and it said the points that seemed to imitate what he described as devil's horns. And the face of this strange man was very pale, but he had a very well groomed moustache with a pointy Van Dyke beard. And he had dark eyebrows, and his eyes seemed to have this strange glow to them. And when he looked into his eyes, as though they glowed, they said they were black and soulless, but still had a glow that he was unable to explain. Albert said he instinctively picked up his crowbar and he was ready to whack this guy hard if he began to approach. Now, as he raised up his crowbar, this old, tall gentleman opened his mouth. Which you would think, so, a guy opens his mouth, what's so scary about that? Well, let me tell you, when he opened his mouth, what Albert saw was some very sharp, pointed fangs. And these pointed fangs and this grin with the Devil Van Dyke beard literally terrified Al to the point where he turned and he ran faster than he's ever ran in his life. He said that all he could hear was this cackle that seemed to echo in the alleyways, and this was something he never wanted to even come across in broad daylight, surrounded by hundreds of people. So Albert was a bit of a heavy smoker, very unhealthy, and he found himself that he was out of breath quicker than he hoped. And he slowed down and he looked over his shoulder to see if this sharp-toothed giant elderly man with a pointy beard was closing in behind him. So he was thankful when he looked and could see that this odd guy was no longer behind him. So Albert had the shock of his life, and in all his years as being a man who stalked the night to find his next payday, had never seen anything as terrifying as he did on that night. So, as he continued to make his way towards home, he stuck to the busier sides of the streets just in case, and he kept replaying over the incident that had happened, thinking, did I just dream that? Am I tired or something? Surely to God, there's not a man who's nearly 7 foot tall, who's old and has pointy teeth, who walks the night with a cape. No, it must have been my imagination. So he continued to walk down the lane, and Albert got the shock of his life. Why did he get the shock of his life? I know you all want to know, because there, as he turned the corner, was the old man who had pointy teeth and his Van Dyke beard with glowing eyes that were black and a blue philosopher's brow, was making his way at a very quick pace with his cape blowing in the wind behind him. So Albert knew that there was no way this was a ghost, because he said if it was a ghost, how would the cape flap in the wind? And he still had this glow about him, but it didn't seem to be as prominent as it was when he first seen him. So Albert grabbed his crowbar in his jacket, even though he knew it would be a pointless thing to do, because it wasn't going to do nothing to this guy. He knew. How on earth could someone be threatened to be killed by a crowbar as he attacked this entity or whatever it was, when this entity clearly wasn't from the living? Albert was in no way able to overcome this thing. So he ran off, and he was confused, and he took off and kept running and running, and he kept looking over his shoulder. And as he looked over his shoulder, he said this thing seemed to be gliding or floating towards him, after him, as he gave chase. So with his heart pounding in his chest and his face rosy red as the blood vessels were pumping faster and faster around his body, he noticed that there was something in the distance which he never ever thought he'd be glad to see. For in his sight, just in front of him, was the sight of a police car with some policemen. So you tell me what type of criminal who was out that night to commit a crime would run towards the police to hand himself in for fear of this creature. So as the policeman and Albert seemed to meet, he threw his crowbar and his gloves and he ran towards the policeman. And as I said before, that was something he never ever thought in a million years that is something he would do. So the policeman obviously thought, what type of guy would be out early hours in the morning looking suspicious? So they were very sort of reserved and took it with a pinch of salt as he come towards this guy. But what they found was that this man was in bits. He was shaking, his heart was racing, he was sweating. It was like he was having some trip. That's the way they'd say it, he described it. So as he turned and spoke to the policeman and he explained what had happened, what had gone on, he didn't hold nothing back, and he turned round to show the police this thing that was chasing him, and he was looking, and he said that the figure that was in hot pursuit of him had stopped, and the police were able to see him, and the three of them stood there as this very tall, slender, glowing entity was there. And the police radioed through and asked for backup because they thought something was about to go down. And the policemen were about to approach this person and question him. So they went towards this creature and they had their truncheons out ready, just ready to quickly get their hands on if they needed to. They said that as they went towards this person, they came face to face, and the same thing happened to the policeman. As the sergeant went to speak to this entity and said, "Excuse me, sir, we have a gentleman there that has said that you have begun to stalk and chase this gentleman." And then this entity looked directly at the police, opened its eyes, which terrified the police, I will say, opened his mouth to reveal his pointy, sharp teeth. And then he began to cackle like a madman. The police drew their truncheons thinking he was about to attack, when he seemed to dash off at an incredible speed. Not the incredible speed you would think of a very fit young man, faster than an Olympic runner, I may say. And the figure was in the distance within seconds. So the police were just as shook as Albert. So they went over to Albert, and the other backup arrived, and they went inside the other police car and tried to decipher what had actually gone down, because when Albert first told the story, the policeman who arrived a little bit later in the police car thought he was on a trip. And this is only when the other policemen who were there, who'd seen this creature, entity, vampire, person, whatever you want to call it, and confirmed that no, Albert was not tripping. Albert openly admitted he was about to commit a crime, and he was known to the police, so they knew that this is what he'd done. And he was that scared, he ran off, terrified, being stalked by this entity. I've said before. So there was no more after that night. They drove round to see if they could find him. As Albert didn't commit any crime that night, it was attempted, they think that his punishment was already served for the fear that was sort of put into this guy. So Albert, after that night, had decided he was no longer going to pursue a life of crime and seen it as a warning that he needs to change. Because if there is evil out there, like that creature, his philosophy is there must be a good. For all bad there is good, and for all good there is bad, which is his logic, and it makes sense. So he was literally scared into being a decent human being. Now, after that, he lived his life as a good man. He decided to make something of his life, and he lived till he was in his 60s, I think this was, and he passed some time ago. And when he was interviewed by another journalist, he said that he was intrigued to discover that there are quite a few stories that seem to make a pattern of these type of creatures seem to be around the Aintree side of Liverpool. For there are multiple stories, and the next story predates Albert's strange encounter, and it says that I think it was in the 70s, there was the very same nimble, cloaked, tall figure that was seen running at phenomenal speed through Kirkdale Cemetery, and this was witnessed by many children, and it was documented in the local news. Then we skip a decade into the 80s, where there were more reports to this journalist that seemed to confirm this creature, entity, demon, vampire, monster has not aged and still walks the streets in the early hours of the morning to find his next victim. So this same white-haired vampire being had made an appearance to some off-duty care workers by a local hospital, and they said that they had been chased down Lower House Lane by a very tall, white-haired figure. They said this figure seemed to be over 7 feet tall. Now, if you are of 5 foot to 5'10", someone who is 6 foot 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 will be a giant to you. And they said that everything they described this entity to be seemed to correlate all the same as the other reports. So this journalist had mentioned his stories on a local radio program, and he said that he was inundated with calls and letters about a vampire that walks the streets of Liverpool, around the Aintree side of Liverpool. And many of these callers had always commented and said that they have seen him between Kirkdale Cemetery and Long Lane Cemetery, and he's given chase many, many times. And there was a woman that had also seen this pointed fanged creature up until the 2015, and he was in West Derby Cemetery, and this lady had given an interview to say her side of the story, and her story sounded very similar to the other stories, for it was said that this lovely lady in her mid to late 20s was out on a very cold winter's night, and she said that she was awoken because she had this sensation that somebody had got into her room. And she said that she saw a stranger's head resting on the pillow next to her head. She said that it was too dark to make out this gentleman's features, but he had a very pointy beard with white silvery hair, and that his breath had a smell of flowers. And just before this lady was about to scream, she said she heard this creepy guy whisper something in her ear, but she couldn't make out what was said. So she jumped out of bed and ran into her parents' room, and obviously she was screaming, so she woke up the whole house. So there was her mum, her dad, her brothers, sister had all come awake, and she was stood there, and they all went, grabbed a hammer and a bat and went into her bedroom. When they all went into the bedroom was empty, but the window of her bedroom was wide open, and she knew that there's no way she would sleep with the bedroom window that wide open, especially on a winter's night. So that is the encounters of the vampiric entities that seem to stalk the Aintree side of Liverpool. Now, this girl's dad said that he put it down to having a bad, realistic dream, and it was just a ghost that she'd seen, not a real man, and it was all in her imagination. So she still said, if that was the case, Dad, how on earth did the guy, how did the window become wide open? Tell me that. And he was like, you must have done it in your sleep. So, as it stands, we are still unable to solve the case of the vampire that stalks the streets around Aintree and Kirkdale's area. So if you have ever encountered something as creepy as this before, then please do let me know, because I will be more than happy to share your story. And I will investigate more and find some more of these strange tales, because there are quite a few. And if you're really interested in these stories, then do go and have a look on my channel, because there are plenty of spooky stories that involve vampires. So I hope you enjoyed today's story. It's a bit of a long one, but still really interesting. Take care, and I will see you all in the next video. Peace.